Resident Evil is one of the most iconic survival horror franchises ever created. But lately, despite reaching new heights in terms of the quality of its games, Capcom still seems determined to force it into a mold it was never designed for, by turning it into a competitive multiplayer shooter. Games like Umbrella Corps, Resident Evil Resistance, and Resident Evil Reverse tried to bring the series into the competitive multiplayer space. But let's be real, these games didn't just miss the mark, they completely misunderstood what fans want from Resident Evil. Capcom seems to be chasing the success of games like Call of Duty and Fortnite, prioritizing fast-paced action and player-versus-player combat. But here's the thing, Resident Evil has never been about competing for kills. It's about surviving together. First came Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City in 2012. Billed as a tactical third-person shooter, it aimed to mix the horror elements of Resident Evil with team-based combat. But it also offered a variety of competitive online game modes. While I think it's a good thing when a studio tries new things to develop a long-running franchise, the results of this attempt were not a success. It's a generic, clunky experience that has little to do with Resident Evil. Critics and fans alike have criticized it for its poor AI, lack of tension, heavy gameplay, and inability to capture the core identity of the series. The experiment was a failure. The game, developed by Slant 6 Games and published by Capcom, was not a hit with the public. Although the cooperative aspect of the game was well promoted, and shooting games were already huge successes at the time, the target audience simply wasn't interested in a Resident Evil experience of this type, and let Capcom know this through sales and reviews. However, Capcom didn't intend to stop there. The online competitive modes of Operation Raccoon City must have been more successful than the main campaigns. I personally only played the Heroes mode to be able to play as the iconic characters, because Capcom ordered the development of another competitive shooter in the Resident Evil universe. The result of this new attempt? A disaster. Umbrella Corps followed in 2016, and once again, fans rejected this game for several key reasons that highlighted a fundamental disconnect between what the game offered and what the Resident Evil fanbase expected. Resident Evil fans love the franchise for its survival horror roots, tense exploration, resource management, and atmospheric storytelling. Umbrella Corps stripped away these elements entirely, opting for a fast-paced, competitive multiplayer shooter experience that felt more like Call of Duty or Counter-Strike than Resident Evil. No emphasis whatsoever on exploration or story. In fact, there was no story at all. The gameplay mechanics in Umbrella Corps were widely criticized for being clunky and unpolished. The controls felt awkward and unresponsive. The close-quarters combat, which was supposed to be a selling point, felt frustrating and unbalanced. The game's one-life match mode, meant to create tension, often felt punishing and unenjoyable due to the poor mechanics. Fans also criticized the game for its lack of depth and content. Few maps, limited customization, and repetitive game modes meant that players quickly became bored. The game offered no meaningful progression or variety, making it difficult to engage. Although the game used iconic Resident Evil locations and referenced elements of the series' history, these references felt superficial and disconnected. Zombies and other creatures felt more like props than real threats, undermining the survival horror heritage, and little effort was made to integrate the story or themes of the Resident Evil universe into the gameplay. As we mentioned before, Resident Evil fans had little interest in competitive multiplayer at the time, especially since the franchise is built around solitary or cooperative survival experiences. The game's attempt to appeal to the esports scene alienated core fans who wanted a survival horror game. The competitive multiplayer market was already saturated with better, more polished titles, leaving Umbrella Corps without a clear audience. As if things weren't bad enough, Umbrella Corps suffered from technical issues that further soured players' experiences at launch. Ultimately, Umbrella Corps was seen as another failed experiment that prioritized chasing trends over staying true to the Resident Evil brand. Fans didn't just dislike the game, they saw it as a missed opportunity and a misunderstanding of what makes Resident Evil special. This rejection sent a clear message to Capcom. Resident Evil fans want survival horror, tension, and immersion, not generic competitive shooters. Capcom seemed to have learned its lesson, and it would be several years before we saw another attempt to bring Resident Evil to the online competitive gaming scene. After the success of Resident Evil 7 and the remake of Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil was enjoying a real renaissance, and a new golden age was on the horizon. No doubt inspired by the success of Dead by Daylight, Resident Evil Resistance was born, an asymmetrical multiplayer game bundled with the Resident Evil 3 remake. There have been so many problems with Resistance since it was announced that I don't know where to start. The way the game has been marketed has clearly not worked in its favor. Firstly, the game has found itself at the heart of a controversy. The game accompanied the release of Resident Evil 3 Remake, a game that was deemed too short and too different from the original, which is why it is now regarded as a mediocre remake. Resistance was therefore perceived as a product that no one had asked for, which would have sucked up the development time and resources of the Resident Evil 3 remake. A certain feeling of disappointment also overcame some fans, including myself, when the game was fully revealed and explained by the developers. When I first saw these survivors, I couldn't help but think of those in Resident Evil Outbreak. I was therefore won over by the hope of seeing a new chapter in this beloved series. So when the asymmetric nature of the game was announced, I couldn't help but feel a little disappointed instead of pleasantly surprised. Nevertheless, I was curious to see how it would turn out. The asymmetrical nature of Resistance, pitting 4 survivors against one mastermind, was ambitious but poorly executed. Once the release period had passed, the game suffered from a very serious balancing problem between the survivors and the mastermind. It became impossible for new players to have any chance of survival in a match against masterminds of level 200 and above. That is, of course, if they've already been lucky enough to find a match in a full team. And I'm not even talking about latency and synchronization problems. The game failed to generate long-term engagement because it didn't provide enough reasons to return. The game had a limited number of maps and objectives, resulting in a lack of variety and replay value. Matches often felt like the same old routine: repair a terminal, survive waves of enemies, and escape, a cycle that quickly became boring. While Capcom added a few new characters and cosmetics after launch, the updates were minimal and failed to sustain interest. The lack of a substantial roadmap or frequent content updates led to a dwindling player base. I really wonder why Capcom continues to create online games only to let them die after a year. With better balancing, more maps, more iconic and original characters, the game could have been something. Imagine a map of the Spencer estate where you have to escape with your squad of stars. Unfortunately, that's never going to happen. I sincerely believe that Resistance had potential, but that it was squandered by poor management, a lack of regular support from its developers, and a failure to understand what fans wanted. Unfortunately, after a step in the right direction, Capcom returned to its bad habits by offering the very bad Resident Evil Reverse. I still can't believe it, to be honest. How could we believe, after the bitter failure of Umbrella Corps, that fans would welcome with open arms another simplistic and empty shooter? Probably because a certain fortnight had since passed by. Reverse was originally announced as a multiplayer add-on for Resident Evil Village, but has been repeatedly delayed due to development issues. These repeated delays have caused confusion and frustration among fans curious about the experience, especially as it was originally scheduled to launch alongside Village in May 2021. The delays naturally raised expectations for a polished product, but the final version failed to deliver. In the end, the product was just as mediocre as the version proposed during the beta testing phases. Reverse saw the light of day in 2022, when almost everyone had forgotten about it, accompanied by glitches, latency problems, and matchmaking issues. The game has, of course, since faded into oblivion, with no support from Capcom. To recreate the same mistakes as with Umbrella Corps was completely idiotic. The only good thing to come out of all this is the DLC costumes that modders have taken and added to other Resident Evil games. many thanks to the modders. Now, it would be wrong to say that all Capcom's attempts to bring Resident Evil to the online gaming scene have ended in failure. In addition to Resident Evil 5 and 6, which are still excellent cooperative games, the Mercenary and Raid modes were generally well received by the public. I go back to playing them myself quite often with friends. But if you're familiar with the channel, you'll know that I think there's one Resident Evil game in particular that has taken advantage of its online mode while retaining the Resident Evil spirit. That game is, of course, Resident Evil Outbreak. I'll just say that Resident Evil Outbreak remains the best online experience in the franchise because it successfully blends the series' survival horror roots with cooperative multiplayer gameplay. Capcom weren't trying to copy anyone. They dared to experiment, and even if the result, at a time when the infrastructure for online gaming was still in its infancy on consoles, wasn't what they had hoped for, the game is still alive and kicking today, thanks to passionate fans who dream of seeing the Outbreak series brought back to life. Unlike later online Resident Evil games, Outbreak retained the franchise's tense atmosphere, limited resources, and immersive environments. Players had to work together to solve puzzles, manage scarce resources, and survive challenging scenarios, emphasizing teamwork over competition. Each scenario offered a self-contained story, giving players a variety of challenges while staying true to the Resident Evil universe. Diverse characters with unique abilities encouraged different strategies and added depth to the experience. Its innovative approach to online co-op made Outbreak feel like a natural extension of Resident Evil. That's why its story is canon. And fans continue to praise it as an example of how online multiplayer can enhance the series without sacrificing its identity. Unfortunately, remaking such an ambitious game today would be a risky gamble for Capcom. It would be a costly undertaking with no guarantee of success. I guess that's why they keep selling us bland online PvP competitive bonus modes that are easier to produce. But after all these failures, couldn't the money and time invested in these games have been used to create an ambitious game that would have put everyone on the same page? If Capcom is looking for the easy way out, why not start with a new The Mercenaries game? I see this as a potential success if Capcom feeds this game with regular updates, offers maps based on iconic locations we've visited in the franchise, and original maps, brings back well-known and even forgotten characters from the series. This could reignite interest in the old games and possibly make Capcom realize that Resident Evil Online is at its best when it involves co-op, dark atmosphere, and PVE. At least that's my opinion. What do you think? Happy New Year, everyone! For this first video of the year 2025, allow me to wish you good health, filled with joy and success. It's been a great year for my channel, at least since I decided to commit myself fully to it last summer. I'm trying to bring you at least one video a week, even though my work obviously takes up most of my time, and this has enabled the channel to grow. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your commitment to the channel. Your likes, comments, and shares warm my heart. Just a year ago, I wouldn't have believed it possible. I have to admit, even if it's still a far-off dream, the idea that one day my channel could be my only job is a prospect that gives me hope for the future. As our parents told us when we were children, the most important thing in life is to do what you love. I love working on my channel, so thank you again for taking part in this journey. I hope you enjoyed the video, and of course I look forward to your feedback on the subject now that the discussion has been opened. Take good care of yourselves, fellow survival horror enthusiasts. We'll meet again soon.